This video is a complete end-to-end walkthrough showing how to build an application that is hosted in Microsoft Azure using the database first entity framework. It's going to be a CRUD application, meaning we can create, read, update, and delete data. The data that's going to be used for this application is going to be data that originated on-premise, meaning we're going to replicate the scenario where we've got on-premise data and then we're going to host it in Azure. And then part of this application too is we're going to use user authentication to control what parts of the program can be accessed. I'm going to start things off by actually showing you the application first, so you can kind of see what it is that we're going to build before we start building it. So I'll do a real quick demo here. So this is the first screen when you open up the application, and this is hosted in Azure, and it says Azure Truck Data Application. And the data that we had on premise that we're now hosting in Azure is truck data, and by truck data I mean like pickup trucks, you know, Chevy, Ford, Dodge, that kind of thing. And then if you look below here, there are a couple of links. The first link says list truck detail. The second link says list truck brands. These are the links that are going to take us to our data where we can create, update, delete. Functionality of these two links is controlled by user authentication. The user needs to log in to access these resources, and then depending on how you log in, you'll have different levels of access, and I'm going to demonstrate that here just real quick. If I click on the list truck detail, it prompts me to log in, and that's because the application is set up to require user authentication, meaning you have to log in. And I have two accounts set up, one's test and one's manager, so I'm going to log in with my test account and show you what we can do with those credentials. And then my browser is set up to save passwords here. And you can see I'm logged in as test. If I go back and click on that first link, yeah, it takes me straight to the data. If I go back to the home page now and click on the other link though, it shows that I'm unauthorized. And that's because I have it set up so that you have to be a manager to get to the brand's information. I'm going to click log off and log in here, and I'm going to log in now with my manager account, and then I'll show you what it is that I can get to as the manager. If I click on the first here, this truck detail, I can still get into there, but now if I click under the truck brands, I can get to the brand information. And to give you just a quick tour here, I'll create a new brand entry here. I'll add Toyota. And as soon as I create it, you can see that it's now listed in the data. I'll show you now too what the entering the detail looks like. We'll create a new one here. I'll make an entry for a Toyota Tundra. And as soon as I click this drop down, you can see Toyota is listed there now. And we'll make this yellow. And then there, it's listed in our data. So that's it. That's the application we're going to build. That was kind of a quick demo, but this is where we're headed. So to build this application, we're going to need some tools, and the tools that we're going to need, number one, we're going to need an Azure account. We're going to need Microsoft Visual Studio for a development environment. We're going to need the Microsoft Data Migration Assistant. And then optionally, there's a file you can download at flyingpuma.com that has a text file in it, and that'll save you some typing. You can do some cut and pasting on here when we do some custom coding. So to get an Azure account, go to azure.microsoft.com. And when I signed up for mine, I could get some services for free, so I signed up for a free account to start with. And then you're going to need Visual Studio. Go to visualstudio.microsoft.com, and there's actually a free version of that, and that is the Community Edition. And that is the version I'm using here. I'm using Community 2019, and my specific version is 16.4.4. And then the other tool, since we're going to move on-premise data to Azure, Microsoft has a tool that helps us, and that's the Data Migration Assistant. So go to the Microsoft Downloads and find the Data Migration Assistant and download that and install it. And then the other thing I mentioned is that if you go to flyingpuma.com, click on the Inner Geek link there, and then there's an article there about creating a CRUD application in Azure. Click on that. As you scroll down, there's a link there to download a zip file. That zip file contains a text file. It's not required, but it'll save you some typing. There's going to be some spots here we're going to do some custom coding, and having that file will enable you to just do some cut and pasting rather than trying to see what it is that I'm typing on the screen and replicate it. Okay, so let's get started. Our very first step here is going to be to build the database. Our goal here is to come up with an application that's hosted in Azure that's going to maintain data that was originally on-premise that we're also going to move to Azure. So our first step here is to establish those database structures and have those available before we ever start the application. So I'm going to open up Visual Studio, and when I open it up here, I'm going to start a new project. And that project is going to be a SQL Server database project. I can use the quick find here to find that template, but I have it in my recent project template, so I'll choose next down here at the bottom. And it prompts me for a name. I'm going to call this Azure MVC Demo. And then I'll go ahead and just leave the other fields and then click Create. And after a few seconds here, it'll create the project for me. Off to the right in the Solution Explorer, I can see where Visual Studio has created the project. And off to the left, I have SQL Server Object Explorer open. If you can't see that, choose View, and then scroll down to SQL Server Object Explorer and choose that. You'll need to have this open so that you can browse and use this. And this just simply lists my database objects that I have locally here. I can expand these and check out what's underneath. I have the servers up top. Underneath here, it shows the project, and this is the project that Visual Studio just built, Azure MVC Demo. And underneath there, I can see what tables are there. And of course, I don't have any tables yet. And so that's going to be our first starting point, is I'm going to build those tables. And I'm going to go up to Tools, SQL Server, New Query. And then once I choose that, it's going to ask me for a connection. And I'm going to connect to just my local machine here. And the database for me is projects v13. Yours might differ from that, but it's going to be a project database. And I'm just going to leave it as Windows Authentication. And before I click Connect, I need to choose the database that I'm going to connect to. And you can see if I use that drop down, I can now see the Azure MVC Demo. I'll select that and choose Connect. And then I've got a query window here that's ready for me. And so to build these tables, I'm actually just going to enter in an SQL query. And this is the first query here, this create table truck detail. And if you wonder how I typed that so fast, that's actually part of our supplement file that you can download. Simply get that and then just cut and paste here. There are minimal fields in this table that we're going to build. The first is the truck ID, and this is really important. This is going to be the primary key to the table, and it's just an integer, an auto-incrementing integer. And then we have a truck description. That'll be just something we type free-form text about the truck. We'll have a truck reference brand ID, and this actually is going to link to our reference table, and then we'll just enter in a truck color again. It'll just be a text field. So those are going to be the fields, real minimal fields here, and I'll select this and run this. It builds the table. And then the second table I'm going to build is going to be the truck reference brands. And this will actually be the table that managers will be able to maintain the data in it. Just two simple fields here. The first is the truck reference brand ID. And again, this is just going to be an integer that's going to serve as our primary key to this. And then the second field is going to be the truck brand name. And that'll just be free-form text where we can type in the brand name of the truck. I'll execute this and create that table. If I go over to the Object Explorer over here and I refresh this, I can expand on my tables underneath the database, and you can see that these two tables have been built. This next step that I'm going to do here is really important. I'm going to define the relationship between these two tables. I'm going to do that by running an SQL query here to add a foreign key. And the foreign key is going to take our truck brand ID in the truck detail table, and it's going to reference the truck reference brand ID in the truck reference brand table. And by doing this up front, that's going to save us some work down the road. When we build the application, the template in Visual Studio will automatically recognize this relationship and will use that to help us when we're building the application. Now that we have our data structures built, I'm going to manually add some data to our tables so that we've got some data in there when we build our application that we can see right away. If I go over to the truck reference brands, I'll enter that in first. And if I right click on this, I can choose View Data. And that opens up a grid that enables us to manually enter in some data. And that's exactly what I'm going to do here is I'm going to manually enter in some brand information. And for this first one here, I'll type in Ford and I'll add Dodge. And then I'll make a third entry here for Chevrolet. And you'll notice that as I've entered these, that SQL Server has automatically added the primary key. This is an auto incrementing integer. So there's 1, 2, 3. So 1 is Ford, 2 is Dodge, 3 is Chevrolet. That's going to be our starting data there. And then I'm going to do the same thing for truck detail. Right click, view data. And again, it'll open up this grid that enables us to manually enter some data. I'll widen these columns here to make this a little bit easier to see. And so the first one, I'll build an F-250. This is a Ford pickup. And then Ford was brand ID number 1. So I'm going to enter in the 1 here and we'll make this a red pickup. For the second one, we'll do a Chevy Silverado. And Chevrolet was brand ID 3. And we'll make this white. And so that'll be our starting data for our application, just a couple of records here. And that'll be enough to get us started so that when we build it, we can see that we have data and things are working. And then just as a quick validation, I'm just going to run a quick select query here that joins these two tables together to see what the results are. And as I run this, yeah, I can see that it worked. The F-250 pickup with a brand ID of 1 pulls up the data from Ford. Same thing with the Silverado. And so I don't need to save this query. I just wanted to validate that. And so I'm done here. I've established the database structures. I put in some sample data, and I want to close this solution so that's no longer open in Visual Studio before I proceed with building the application. And then I can see over here in the Solution Explorer that that's now empty. So I'm ready to start the application. So our next step here is to open up a new project in Visual Studio. And I'm going to follow the wizards for this. I'm going to go up to File, New, Project. And my project template is going to be ASP.NET Web Application, .NET Framework, C#. And I have that in my recent project templates. I could use this little search template and type that in there, but it's right here. So I'm just going to select it here and choose Next. And then I need to give it a project name. I'm simply going to call this Azure MVC Truck Demo. And the rest of these fields here, I'll just leave as their defaults. I'll choose Create. Then it prompts me for which template I want to use. So this is going to be Model View Controller. So I'm going to select MVC here. And then up on the right side here, I'm going to change our authentication. So our goal in making this project is to create an application where we're going to authenticate the users, and we're going to use that authentication to control what they can and cannot do within the program. So I'm going to change that to individual, choose OK. The rest of these I'm going to leave as their default and choose Create. After a few moments, Visual Studio returns to this window here, and it has built the project for you. So that's it. That's how to get this started. Our next step here is to build the models. We have two data tables. We have trucks detail, trucks reference brands. We need to build a way for the application to get to this data and use it, and that's what models are about. So I'm going to go over here to models. I'm going to right click, and I'm going to choose Add, New Item. And then on the left-hand side, I'm going to choose Data, and then I'm going to select the very first option there, that ADO.NET Entity Data Model for Visual C#. Then down at the bottom here, I'm going to give the model a name, and I'm going to call this Trucks Detail. And then I will choose Add. And then I'm going to follow the wizard. We're going to use the Entity Framework Designer from Database. This is Database first. Choose Next. And then it has us establish our connection. I'm going to click on New Connection. Our data source is going to be Microsoft SQL Server. And you see here under the server name, there's nothing populated here. So our server name is going to be my local instance here, this local DB projects v113. I'm actually just going to type that in for my server name. Then once I have that typed in, I can use this connected database down here, and I can see my trucks data listed. I'm going to select that. And then I'm going to leave the authentication model as Windows Authentication, and I'll choose OK. It shows me my connection string. I'm going to leave this box checked for save connection settings in web config, and then it provides a name. I'll leave it as the default. I'll choose next. And then I need to select the objects that are going to be part of this model. So if I expand this, I'm going to choose the truck detail and the truck reference brands. Down here at the bottom, it automatically gives me a suggested namespace. I'm just going to leave that and choose finish. And then after a moment, Visual Studio comes back to this window and it gives a visual representation of the data. And you'll notice that between these tables, it shows the link. And that's because when we were setting up our data, we took the time to define our foreign keys. And that is really important. If you do that when you're setting up your data and you define those foreign keys, Visual Studio will automatically recognize that relationship, and it saves you a step here. And then off to the right here, we can see that it has added model information to get to our tables. If I expand that, you can see that there's now one for the truck detail. So that was pretty straightforward. That's all that's required to set up our models. I'm going to go up here and I'm going to close this tab, and then I'm going to build this solution. So from the menu, I'm going to choose Build Solution. This is really important. After you make your models, you need to build the solution, because from this point forward, if we don't have those models built, things will not work and you're going to get some errors. So after the build completes, you can see down here in the output window, you get confirmation that the build succeeded. And that's it. We're ready to go. Off to the right here, we have our models ready to go. So our next step is to build the controllers and views. I'm going to start by right-clicking on controllers. I'll choose Add, and then New Scaffolded Item. I'm going to choose MVC5 Controller with Views using Entity Framework, and then I'll choose Add. For my model class, I'm going to end up doing this twice. So I'm going to do the truck detail first. So I'll scroll down and I'll choose the truck detail. And then my content class, I'll choose the truck detail entities. And the rest of these, I will leave as their default value. And you can see that Visual Studio is automatically given a controller name of truck detail controller. I'll choose Add. And then Microsoft Visual Studio will build that first controller. I'm going to close this, and then I'm going to do the same thing again, and I'm going to build another controller for our truck's reference brand. So New Scaffolded Item, MVC Controller with Views with Entity Framework. I'll choose Add again. For the model class, I'll scroll down and then I'll choose the other one, and that'll be the truck reference brand. I'll use the same truck's data entities. I'll just leave the default value for the controller name, and then I'll choose Add. And that's it. So Visual Studio has built the controllers, and then we can see over here on the right side, if I scroll down, I all of a sudden now have views for my truck's details and for the truck's reference brands. Now that we've built our views to get to the truck detail, we want to add those views to our home page so we can see them in the application. I'm going to go over here to Views, and I'm going to expand the views in the Home folder. And then I'm going to open up this index CSHTML. At the top of this file, there's some pre-built branding here. I'm going to insert some rows and give us some space to work with. And then I'm going to start by inserting a div. And again, I'll make some rows here. And then I want to insert 2 action links. And these links are going to take us to the views that we just built. So the first one will be here, the list for truck details. I'll go back and talk about these here in just a second when I finish typing. So that's what our action link looks like. This truck details in that index, that comes from this folder over here. That has to match that name, and it has to be the name of the file that we're going to pull up here, that index. That has to match. And then this list truck detail, that's simply what's going to be visible within the application. I'm going to insert a a hard-coded line break here. And then I'm going to do the exact same thing for the truck reference brands. This will be the same as the link above, but when I get to the folder reference here, it's going to say truck reference brands instead of truck details. That's what those two action links look like. That's what we need to add in here, and that's enough to get these to appear within our application. So let's stop here for a moment and let's take a quick peek at the application so far. I'm going to go up here to the menu bar and I'm going to choose Debug. And I'm going to click on Start Debugging, and I can hit F5 to do the same thing. Let me pull this application down here so you can see it. Our application runs. Yeah, this is what our application looks like so far. There's a lot of Microsoft branding that's pre-built in this page, and we'll take that out later. But here you can see this list truck detail and the list truck brands. Those are those two views that we just added to this page. And so let's go into the first one, the list truck detail. Yeah, there's our data. The F-250 pickup, it's red. The Ford, the Silverado, white and Chevrolet. That's the information that we pre-entered into our data. You'll notice here in this first line, though, that it says Ford under truck reference brand name. So in our table, though, we actually just put in an integer of 1. So that lookup to the truck reference brand happened automatically. And that's the beauty of predefining those keys. We'll go into the brands here. Yeah, there's our brand. So we got a working application. Let's test out some functionality. Let's see if we can create a new one. We'll add Nissan. Click create. Yeah, it's in my list. Let's see if the delete works. Great. So we've got a working application, but you'll notice one thing that isn't happening here is there's no user authentication. That was one of our goals in coming up with this. We want to use user authentication to control access. So that's where we're headed next. We're going to make it so that a user has to log in to be able to get to this data. All right, so now we're going to add user authentication to this application, and that is done over here in the controllers. I'm going to open up the truck detail controller, and then underneath the namespace and before that first public class right here, I'm going to insert some blank rows to give us some room to type. I'm going to start a bracket and type in the word authorize. And that's it. That's all I have to type in here for now. And I will save and close this. And then I'm going to do that exact same thing to my truck reference brand controller. After the namespace and before that public class, I'll insert some rows. And within brackets, I will type the word authorize. Let me save and close this. Let me run the application and show you what just doing that does here. So now, if I go here and click on this list truck detail, it takes me to a login page. So just by adding authorize, it makes me log in. So let me see if I can log in. I'll use test@test.com and I'll just give it a password. Let me see if I can log in. Right, gives invalid login attempt. And that's because I'm not registered as a user. So let's go ahead and do that. I'll register as a user. I'll use this test@test.com for our testing, and I'll give it a password. And I'll register, and I'll save this. Okay, so now if I go to this list truck detail, I'm logged in. Let's see if it takes me in. Yeah, it takes me straight to the data. So just by adding authorize to our controllers, that made it so I had to log in to get to that data. So let me show you a couple of things that happened here. Let's go over to this SQL Server here and let me refresh this. And I'm going to expand this top database here. I've got something new here. I've got a new database, this ASP.NET MVC truck demo, the number beside it there. That's new. If I expand this, we can see the tables. All of these tables were automatically built. Let's look at this ASP.NET users. Let me expand this so we can see what's in here. That first record there we go. That's my registration, test@test.com. All of these tables over here were automatically built simply by adding that authorize to my controllers. The application built this for us, so we didn't have to do anything special. So one of our goals in building this application is to use user authentication to control access. So right now, the way we have it, you have to be logged in to get to the truck detail or the truck brands, but we want to take that a step further. We want to make it so that only supervisors can get to the truck brands and end users can get to the truck detail. Right now, if I click on this list truck brands, it'll take me to my login. I can log in as that test@test.com, and it takes me to the brands. There was nothing that happened in the background to check to see if I'm a supervisor that I should actually be able to get to this data. So we're going to build that functionality now. To make our authorization role specific, we need to start with our tables here, and we need to add some information. So I'm going to start by going to this ASP.NET roles. I'll open this up and view the data. And I'm going to build two new roles within our application. The first will be role ID number 1, and I'll let that be supervisor. And we'll build a second role, and this will be ID number 2. That'll be end user. So there we go. We have two roles within our application. One is supervisor, 2 is end user, and then we're going to use those. And then I'll go down here to this ASP.NET user roles, and I'll open this up and view the data. And you see there's just two fields, user ID and role ID. This is a cross-reference table. It links a user ID to a role. And if I open up our users, and I look at the first record here for this test@test.com, there's my user ID. Let me expand this. I'm going to highlight this. I'm going to copy this. I'm hitting Control-C to copy this to my clipboard. Go over here, I'm going to paste that in as a user ID, and then I'm going to assign that user ID to role number 2. We'll make this user an end user. So test@test.com is now an end user. So now that I have some roles and I've assigned a user to a role ID, we need to make some changes in our controllers again. So I'm going to start by going over here to the truck brands controller. Let me open that up again. And back here where we typed in this authorize, I'm going to change this just a little bit. Within those brackets, I'm going to add a parenthesis, and I'm going to type in roles equals and then a quote, and then I'm going to enter the roles that this can access. And in this case here, since it's the brands, it's just going to be supervisor. So role equals supervisor. So that's what I add after the authorize. And let me save and close this. And then I'm going to do something similar to the truck detail. Again, within the authorized brackets here, I'm going to add that parenthesis, and I'm going to define the roles. And this time, I'm going to make it so that both the supervisor and the end user can access the detail. So to do that, I literally within quotes type in supervisor, comma, end user. So those are both within the quotes. And that's important to the formatting here. And I'll add the bracket, and I'll save and close this. So let's go run the application real quick, and we'll see what that did for us. Now in the application, when I click list truck detail, I'm expecting it to prompt me to log in, and it does, and I'm going to log in, and it takes me to the detail. But if I go back to the home page here and I click on the list truck brands, I am logged in, but I'm not expecting to get the detail, and it doesn't allow me to get to that detail. It takes me back to the login page. And we're going to come back here in a minute and talk about this, about why it took us back to the login page. But let's go test out the other user ID here real quick. So I'm going to go back into the user roles table here, and I'm going to switch the role for my test ID to be a supervisor. So I currently have it as 2, which is end user. Let me change that to a 1, which makes it a supervisor. Let me close this. Let's run the application again. Now that I'm set up as a supervisor, I expect to be able to get to both. So I'll click in, log in. Yeah, it takes me to the brands. Okay, so you remember before when we were just an end user, it took us back to the login page, and I'll go back and we're gonna revisit that. I'm gonna go back into the data here, and I'm gonna reset that test user to back to an end user, role ID 2. We'll go back into the application and talk about this. When I go into the list truck brands and click on it, it prompts me to log in, and you saw that just refreshed. It took me right back to the login page, but if I go to the detail, it allows me to get to the detail, but when I click on truck brands, it takes me to the login page. Okay, so I am logged in, but when I click on it, it takes me to a login page. So the application is working in that it doesn't allow me to get to the data because I'm not a supervisor, but that's not quite what we want to have happen. When we click on this list truck brands, we don't want to go to a login page. We want to go to a page that says you're not authorized. And we're going to set up that functionality now. So to create a view for our unauthorized page, I'm actually going to copy one of these existing views underneath our shared folder here, and I'll use that as a template. So I'm going to copy this error CS HTML. I'm just going to choose copy, and then I'm going to paste that right back into that same folder, and you'll see now that it's error/copy. I'm going to rename that to unauthorized. And I'm going to use this then as a template then to create our new view. And I'm going to open this up, and I'm going to change the title here to unauthorized. And then the rest of this information down below here is what's actually going to be visible on the web page. And so I'll start with just simply saying unauthorized, and then I'll give it a description of you are not authorized to access this resource. And that'll be it. That's going to be our unauthorized landing page. And then I will save this, and this is ready for us to use. So now that we have our unauthorized view built, we're going to modify our controllers to use that view. And I'm going to start here in this account controller.cs. And underneath the namespace here, I'm going to insert some rows. And what we're going to do is we're going to build a custom authorized handler. And I'm going to make a little note here. I'm just going to mark where the original code is. That way if I make a mistake, I can go back and I know what it is that I've changed. At flyingpuma.com, there's a supplemental text file that can be downloaded, and this has the code that I'm going to paste in here. This is a custom authorized class handler, and if you don't have that download, you can stop the video here to read this and copy that out, but I'm just going to do a cut and paste here, and this here is the little chunk that I just pasted in. And so just at a high level here, this is creating a custom authorized handler. And this takes advantage of built-in attributes that are part of the stock authorized controller. And at a high level here, what happens is this just does an if then else. When we click on a resource that needs authorization, it looks to see if the user is already authenticated. And if they don't have access but they're authenticated, it'll take them to our unauthorized page. And if not, if they're not logged in and authenticated, it takes them to the account login. And again, this is custom authorized, and they did this in the account controller.cs. And then I'm going to save this here. And now that we have that custom handler built, we need to add that to our trucks detail and our trucks reference brand controllers. And so I open those up, and all I need to do here is where this says authorize, I simply need to change that to custom authorize to match the handler that we just built. And then I need to do that to both of them. I'll go to the truck reference brands and do that exact same thing where it says authorize. I will change this to custom authorize. And that's it. That is all we need to do then to use our unauthorized view. So let's run the application and see what we have here. Okay, so I'm not logged in, and I'm going to click on this list truck detail. Okay, and since I'm not logged in, it takes me to the login. I'm going to go ahead and log in, and then I'm going to return to the home page here once it's logged in. And now when I click on the list truck detail, right, because I'm logged in, it takes me to the data, and that was the expected behavior. If I go back to my home page though, and I click on this list truck brands, I shouldn't be able to get to this, so it shouldn't take me to the data, and I don't want it to take me to the login page. So let's click on it here and see what happens. Yeah, it takes me to the unauthorized page. So instead of doing what it did before, where it took me back to the login page, it's doing what it is that we want it to do, and that is it takes me to a page that says you're unauthorized. If you look at our home page here, there's a lot of Microsoft branding that was part of the template that automatically built here. We've got all this information about ASP.NET and these three things below. I'm going to log out. We're going to clean this up. We're going to go back into Visual Studio. And underneath our views, underneath this home folder, we're going to open up index.cs.html. And this is where we're going to make some changes here to clean that up. At the very top here, where they've got that big ASP.NET header, we'll change that to Azure Truck Data Application. And then they've got an ASP.NET link here. I'm just going to delete that. And then we'll give it our own description here. And we'll just type in, this is a sample data first application for Azure. We'll leave the links that we added. And then down here, they've got some other branding. I'm actually going to leave that in there. I'm going to just comment it out, and I'm leaving it in there because then if I later want to go back and use their code and customize it for my own use, I can. So I'm just going to put some comments around this. And then we'll save this. Let's go see what that looks like. Yeah, quite a bit better. So we got rid of a lot of that branding that was pre-built in, and we can see now that this is our application. And I think we're at a good point here. We've got our application working the way that we want. We can publish this to Azure. So now that we have the application working the way that we want to, our next step is to publish it into Azure. And to do that, we go over here in the Solution Explorer, and we highlight the solution, and we right-click on it, and we choose Publish. And this starts up a wizard for us. And first thing it does is pick a publish target, and we're going to choose the app service. And I'm going to create a new one. If you have an existing app service already set up in Azure, you could use that, but I'm going to start with a new one here, and I'm going to click on Create Profile. And then when I click on that, it starts this wizard to create a new one, and that might behave a little bit differently for you. It went straight here for me because it recognizes that I'm already signed into my Microsoft account. And so since it signed in, it took me straight here. So when you do this, it might prompt you to sign in. And I don't have any subscriptions here, so it's just going to create a new subscription. And then also with my my Azure account, I don't have any resource groups, so it's going to suggest one. Then you'll notice here in this hosting plan, I'm going to click on this new under this hosting plan, and you look at the size of this. This says S1. I'm going to change that because at the time that I'm making this video, you can actually get a free one, and so I'm going to choose free and click OK. And then I'll leave the rest of those things. If you look at over here at the resources that are going to be created, it shows that it's going to recreate a hosting plan and an app service. I need something else. I need a SQL database out there. So I'm going to click on create a SQL database, and it's going to start a wizard to create a database. And if I click on the down handle here, I don't have a database server. So again, here I'm going to click on new. I'm going to create a new instance out there. And again, that just keeps firing up the wizard. And then I'm going to accept the defaults here. And then it's asking for a username. I'm going to open up Notepad here because I'm going to keep track of our username and our password here so I can refer to it. And we'll just make a long Azure username. That'll be our admin name. And I'm just going to copy that out. And then it's asking for an administrator password. And I believe that there's strength requirements on this. So I actually have my own password generator. I'm going to use that here to generate a password. Let me pop that up. Yeah, okay, I'm just looking at the rules here that I've had. That's fine. So I'll generate a password. There, perfect. I'm going to just copy and paste that and keep that in Notepad, and we'll use that password. And then I'm going to enter that back in the wizard. And then I'll click on OK. And then here for the database, I'm going to accept the default connection string and the defaults that it filled in for me. And I'm going to click OK again. And now you can see under our resources, it lists the SQL Server database, the SQL Server instance, as well as our hosting plan and the app service. So those things are all going to be created here when I click this create button, and I'll go ahead and do that. And after a little bit of time, it continues with the wizard, and then it returns it here, and I'm just going to click publish. And then as it builds this out, it's actually going to open up an internet browser here and try to go to the application. So we'll give this a little bit of time here. And there we go. As easy as that, this application is now hosted in Azure. All right, so now that we have this hosted in Azure, let's poke around here a little bit and see what we can do. Let's see if we can log in. I'll click log in here. And it takes me to the login screen. I'll try to log in with our test account. I'll give it a password. When I choose login, it gives me an error message. It says invalid login attempt. And that's because Azure is not aware of our local accounts. We built registered this account locally, not in Azure. So we need to register this account in Azure. And so I'm going to click register as a new user, and I'll use that same account and give it a password. And I'll click register, and I'll save this. So now you can see at the top that I'm logged in. So let's see if I can get to the truck detail. Yeah, it says unauthorized. And that's because we haven't built any of our roles in Azure. So those same things that we did locally where we built roles and we associated them with user IDs, we need to do that in Azure. So I'm going to close this out, go back to Visual Studio, and then over here on the left under SQL Server, I'm going to add a SQL Server. And what I'm going to add is our Azure instance. And so I can choose that here, Azure. And then as soon as I do that, you can see the database that we just built. I'll choose that, and then I'll give it our admin username and then the password, and I'll just cut and paste that out of Notepad. I saved that over here. And I'll tell it to remember the password. And when I choose connect, it's going to give me a pop-up. It's asking me to add my IP address to the Azure firewall. So this is a built-in security feature within Azure, and so I need to add my local IP address to that firewall to be able to get to this database. And so I'm going to choose OK here and allow that. And then when I do that, I can see our Azure instance over here. And so I'm going to expand this, and then I'll expand the databases and the tables. Yeah, I can see the tables that are related to our ASP.NET users. So I'm going to open up this bottom one and view the data. And our first entry there is the test account that we just built. So I need to do the same things here that we did locally, in that I need to build those roles for the end user and the supervisor, and then I need to associate users to those roles. So I'm going to open up ASP.NET roles. And I'm going to build role ID number 1, and that will be for a supervisor, same as we did before. And then role ID number 2 will be for end user. And then I'm going to go associate that test account user ID to role number 2. And that's done here in this ASP.NET user roles. I'll view the data on that. And I will just cut and paste that user ID for our test account. And I'll assign that to role number 2 for the end user. And then I'm going to jump out to the application and actually register another user. We'll set up a manager, so we'll register another one. And this will be manager@test.com. I'll give it a password. And then as soon as I register it, I'll save that again. You can see that here that I'm logged in as manager, so that's been saved. So back over here in Visual Studio, I'm going to go back to our ASP.NET users table, view the data, and I'm going to copy that ID for the manager, and I'm going to open up our ASP.NET user roles table, and I'm going to associate that manager ID with role ID number 1 for supervisor. Okay, so we have now replicated what we did locally into Azure, meaning we've built some users, we've built some user roles, and we've associated those users with those roles for the application to use. So let's go back to the application and let's see what we can do here. I'm going to log in as the test account, and as an end user, I should not be able to get to the list truck brand, so I'll try that. And that gives me the unauthorized. That's expected. Let's see if I go to the truck detail and see what happens. Yeah, it gives me an error message. And that's because at this point here, the Azure application is unaware of our truck data. We have all that data locally. We haven't migrated it to Azure. So when we try to access that data here, it gives us an error. So that's where we're headed next. We're going to take that local truck data and we're going to move it to Azure. So currently we have our data just in our local database under our trucks data in those 2 tables. I'm going to use Microsoft's Data Migration Assistant to move this data to Azure. And that was one of the things I mentioned in the prerequisites was to download Microsoft Data Migration Assistant. I'm going to start the assistant and we'll just follow the wizard. First thing it has you do is click on New. So I'll click on that. And then this is going to be a migration. And then the project name, I can give this any project name. I'll just type in a project name here. It has no meaning. Source is going to be SQL Server. Our target is going to be Azure. And then the migration scope, we're going to copy the schema and data. So we'll build the tables and copy the data both. And then I'm going to go ahead and click on Create here. Connect to the source server. This is referring to the local server here. And that's this project V13, and I'll be able to select that from the drop-down. And then authentication, that's fine. Windows authentication, I can click on connect and just leave those as is. And it shows my trucks data database, and that is what we want to migrate. So I'll go ahead and click on next. I have that selected. And then the target, this is referring to the Azure SQL Server. I'm going to get that name of that server over here. I'm going to look at the properties and then look at the connection string. And I'll expand this out here. I'm literally going to copy that server name right after the data source equals. I'll copy that. And then I'll paste that back into the wizard over here. The authentication type will be SQL Server authentication. That just means that I'm going to give it a username and password, and I'll paste in the username and password that I saved over here in Notepad. And then I'll leave this as an encrypted connection, and then I'll go ahead and choose connect. Yeah, I'm pretty quick. It's connected to my Azure SQL Server. And so since it recognizes that connection, I can go ahead and choose next down here. And then this is just prompting me for the objects that are going to be created in the Azure database. And it's going to be these two tables. And so I'll go ahead and generate the SQL script to create those tables. And then now that the script has been generated to build those tables, I'm going to go ahead and deploy it. And you can see that that runs just super fast. To build those two tables took really just a second. And so now we have our tables built, and the next thing is now to move the data into those tables. And so I'll click on Migrate Data. And then again, it shows me the two tables that are going to be moved, gives me the row count. And so I'll start the data migration. Yeah, and it's finished. It took all of 4 seconds. Of course, I don't have a lot of data. And that's it. This migration assistant is really easy to use. And so I'm going to close this out, and it'll prompt me to save here, but there's really nothing to worry about saving. And then just to show you where we're at so far, I'm going to go into the application and show you what happens if we log in and try to access the data. So I'll log in as the manager, that's fine. And as the manager, I should be able to get to the truck brands. And when I click on that, it still gives me an error. And the reason is even though we've moved the data to Azure, the Azure application doesn't know how to connect to that data yet. And so that's what we're going to do next, is we're going to build a connection string to connect the application to the data. So to build the connection string, I'm going to go back to Visual Studio here, and I'm going to open up our web config file. And that is just in the root. It's not in a subfolder. And then within this web config file, there's a section here for connection strings. I'm going to copy out the name of our connection string, which is that truck data entities. And I'm going to use Notepad as kind of a workspace here to help build the connection string. So I pasted that name, and I'm going to use Notepad here, and I'll copy things between the web config in here, and I'm going to use the connection string that's in the web config as a template to come up with the connection string that's needed for Azure. And so this whole line here for the truck data entities, I'm going to select that whole line and I'm going to copy it. I'm going to go back into Notepad, I'm going to paste that, and then I'm going to delete everything from where it says connection string equals. I'm going to delete all of that up through where that equals was. And then near the end of this, where it says provider connection string equals, I'm going to delete everything after the equals sign. Okay, so this is going to be my working template, and I'll just use Notepad to work on it. That's my starting template for building the connection string for Azure. So now what we need to do is we need to have that provider connection string. So where do we get that? Well, we can actually get that from SQL Server. We attached our Azure database locally here. So if I go into the properties of that Azure database, there's our connection string. So I'm actually going to cut and paste right out of here. I'm going to highlight that all the way through the end of where my password is, and I'll keep those asterisks, and I'm hitting Control-C here. I'm going to go back to Notepad, and I'm just going to paste that here to give us some working room here. And so this whole data source that came from our Azure database locally is going to be appended to our template down below. But the way it is now, it has those asterisks in there for my password. I need to put in the actual password. And so I'm going to go back over to Notepad where I've saved the password, and I'll cut and paste that. And then I'm going to replace those asterisks with the actual password here. And then this whole line here, I'm going to highlight and copy, and I'm going to paste that to the end of our template connection string. So at the end of this second line here, I'm going to go back to where it says provider connection string equals, and I'm going to type a quote, and then I'm going to paste that and then put in an end quote. And this whole line here is what's needed in Azure to access the data. So from here, I'm going to copy that into Azure. Okay, so I'm going to log into my Azure account, and under my resources, I'm going to go to the app service, and that's the app service for my trucks demo. Underneath in the app service, there's configuration settings, and under configuration settings, there's connection strings. Click new connection string, and then in this value box, paste in that connection string that we just built over in Notepad. The name here has to exactly match the truck data entity, so I'm going to copy and paste that, and then the type will be custom. And that is the connection string information that Azure needs to access the data. I click on OK, and then once I see that it's listed here, it's really important to click on Save so that those changes are saved. I'll click Save and Continue. You can see in the upper right that it's updating the settings. So the way that this works, when the application runs, instead of relying on the information that's in the web config file, it looks here at the connection strings for the truck data entities to get the connection string information to connect to the data that's hosted in Azure. So let's start the application, and let's see how this works. I'm going to log in as the manager, and let's see if I can get to the truck detail. Yeah, it's working. There's our data. So I'll go back to the home page. As a manager, I should be able to get to the truck brands, and I can. Let's test some functionality, see if I can create a new one. We'll add Toyota. Yeah, it's listed there. It seems to be working. Let's log off and log in as the test account. And the test account should be able to get to the detail, but not the truck brand. So let's see if I can get to the truck detail. I can. Let's see if I can get to the brands. Unauthorized. Perfect. Okay. We've met our objective here. We've built a basic CRUD application, hosted in Azure. We migrated local data to Azure, and we are using user authentication to control what can be accessed within the application. Thank you for watching the video, and I hope you found something useful.